The snow does not forget what it covers. Long after the living have gone back to their fires and their certainties, long after the pack has closed its borders and turned its back on the thing it decided it did not want, the snow holds the shape of whatever was placed inside it. It holds warmth for a little while, and then the warmth fades and the cold moves in, and the shape beneath becomes indistinguishable from all the other shapes the winter makes when it is simply being winter. This is how they left him. Not with ceremony. Not even with the deliberateness of cruelty, which at least requires you to look at what you are doing. They left him the way you leave something you have decided has no future in your world, quickly and with the intention of not thinking about it again. He was 3 days old. He had been born without sight into a pack that understood blindness to mean uselessness, and in a territory where usefulness was the only currency that purchased the right to exist. A blind pup was a debt the pack had decided it would not carry. So they left him in the snow of the high ridge in the deepest dark of a winter night, 3 days old and barely the weight of 2 cupped hands, and they went back to their fire. What they did not account for was the silver wolf. She ran the high ridge alone every third night, the way she had run it for 4 years, and she would have told you, if you asked her at any other moment in her life, that she ran it for no particular reason beyond the fact that the ridge was hers and the running was hers, and the night had always felt more like company than the pack she had left. On this particular night she ran the ridge, and the snow told her something. Not in words. The snow does not use words. It told her the way cold things tell you what they hold, with a difference so small that only the right kind of attention catches it. A warmth where there should not be one. A scent too faint to name but present enough to stop her. She stopped. She dug. What she found changed the shape of everything that came after, and the story of how it changed things, of what a blind pup became and what a silver wolf became in learning to be his and he in learning to be hers, is the story this snow has been keeping. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below, because what happens next will change everything. Now, let's begin the story. The Iron Vale Pack ran the Northern Highland Territories the way packs had run Highland Territories for 300 years, with the firm conviction that the land was made for the strong and that everything else was simply the land waiting to become something the strong could use. This was not philosophy. It was policy. The Iron Vale had codified it in their pack law, written in the long-dead Alpha line that had established the territory, and it had been maintained by every Alpha since with the particular reverence that people reserve for rules that happened to align with what they wanted to do anyway. The law said, a wolf who cannot contribute cannot remain. The law did not specify age. Senna had given birth on the 3rd night of the deep freeze, alone in the den she had prepared with the care that pregnant wolves give to the space where life is going to begin, lining it with the dried grass and her own shed undercoat until it was the warmest place on the ridge. She had been alone because her mate, the pack enforcer, had been away at the southern border since the first signs of her labor began and had not returned. He returned on the morning of the 4th day. There were 3 pups. 2 were the gray-brown of their father's line, solid and loud and already pushing against each other in the instinctive practice of wolves who are learning that the world has limited space and you must secure your portion of it. The 3rd was pale, almost white, and lay slightly apart from his siblings with the stillness that Senna had noticed from the first hours and had spent 3 days telling herself meant nothing. Her mate, whose name was Draven and who had the build and the manner of a man shaped entirely by the requirements of his position, crouched at the entrance of the den and looked at the 3 pups. He looked at the pale one longest. He reached in and passed his hand in front of the pale pup's face. The pup did not track the movement. His nose worked, catching his father's scent, but his eyes, pale and unfocused and cast in the wrong direction, did not follow. Draven sat back on his heels. He looked at Senna with the expression of a man who has found a problem he intends to solve efficiently. Senna said, before he could speak, he is only 3 days. He may still develop. Draven looked at the pup. The eyes of a pup opened blind and came to sight over the first weeks. The ones that did not come to sight, the ones whose eyes had the particular cast of damage rather than immaturity, were not going to come to sight. He had seen it before. He said, "You know what this means under pack law?" She said, "He is 3 days old." He said, "That is not the relevant consideration." She looked at her pup. She had spent 3 days with her nose against his small pale head, learning the specific version of him that was already distinct and present despite being 3 days old. She had learned the pattern of his breathing and the particular way he turned his face when he was hungry and the specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of weakness but the stillness of a creature gathering information from every source available to it. She said, "I will not let you." He said, "This is not your decision alone." He was right about that. That was the specific cruelty of pack law in the Iron Veil territory. No single wolf could override the pack law, not even a mother over her own pup, and the pack law on this question was unambiguous. The Alpha was called. The Alpha was a woman named Hara Felt who had held the position for 11 years and who had never in those 11 years permitted sentiment to override law, because she had understood from the first day of her tenure that a pack that made exceptions to its own rules on the basis of feeling was a pack that had begun the process of unraveling. She looked at the pale pup with the same assessor's attention she gave to every difficult question, and she saw what Draven had seen. She gave the order at sunset. Senna did not fight. She had known the moment Draven came back from the border that this was what was going to happen, and she had had 3 days to understand that fighting the pack law with claws and teeth would accomplish nothing except teaching her 2 healthy pups that their mother had broken at the worst moment. She did something else instead. In the hours between the order and the time it was carried out, she held her pale pup against her chest and she put her nose against his head and she stayed there. She breathed him in. She learned every particular of him with the complete deliberateness of someone who is doing a thing they will not be permitted to do again and is making sure they do it fully. And she said something into his small unhearing ear, something she said not because he could understand language but because she needed to put it into the world and he was the world to her, and so she said it to him. She said, "You are more than they can see. I need you to know that even if you cannot know it yet. You are more." He turned his face toward the sound of her voice with the specific precision that she had noticed in 3 days of watching him orient by sound and scent and the slight movements of air. He found her. She held him. Then they came and took him and carried him to the high ridge in the dark, and they put him in the snow and they filled the snow over him and they went back to the fire. Senna lay in the den with her 2 remaining pups and she pressed her face against the packed earth of the floor and she breathed and breathed and breathed until breathing felt like something she was choosing to do rather than something happening to her. She did not sleep that night. The snow held her pup. And the silver wolf ran the ridge. Her name was Mira Ashend and she had lived alone on the eastern face of the northern highland for 4 years. Which was a significant amount of time to live alone by any measure, and which she had arrived at not by planning but by the gradual accumulation of decisions that were each small and reasonable and which had collectively resulted in a life she had arranged entirely around herself and her own requirements. She was 26 years old. She had left the Ash End pack at 22, not through expulsion or conflict but through the particular kind of departure that happens when a person and the group they were born into are simply not built to occupy the same space. The Ash End pack had not been cruel to her. They had not understood her, which was a different thing, and the years of not being understood had produced the specific quiet exhaustion of someone who has been translating themselves into an intelligible language for so long they have forgotten the original. So she had left. She had found the eastern face of the highland ridge and built a shelter into the rock face that no one else wanted, low to the ground and deep into the stone, warm in the way that the earth keeps warmth even when the air above it has forgotten. She ran the ridge every 3rd night in her silver wolf form, a form that she had been self-conscious about for most of her life because silver wolves were rare enough to attract exactly the kind of attention she had decided she did not want, and which she had eventually stopped being self-conscious about because the ridge did not care what color she was. On the night that changed everything, she ran the ridge from the eastern end toward the high center plateau, the way she always ran it, in the cold and the dark that she had always found more clarifying than threatening. She was on the plateau when the snow told her something. She stopped. She was not a tracker in the professional sense. She could track well enough for her own purposes, and the ridge had made her more attentive to what the land said than she had been in the pack, but she would not have called what she did next a skilled operation. She simply stood still and paid attention to the thing she had noticed, which was a warmth differential in the snow near the western edge of the plateau. A small irregularity in the surface where the cold should have been uniform and was not. She shifted to human form and she knelt and she dug with her bare hands in the snow, which was cold enough to hurt and which she did not stop for. She dug down 6 inches. She found him. He fit in her 2 hands with space remaining. He was pale and still in the way that told her he was at the edge of the cold claiming him entirely, his small body temperature so depleted that the warmth differential she had detected had not been his warmth but the last trace of the warmth the snow had briefly borrowed from him. She brought him up out of the snow and pressed him against her chest. She felt him breathe. 1 breath. 2. She shifted back to wolf form around him without putting him down, which required a specific kind of attention to the shift that she had never practiced but which her body managed because the alternative was putting him in the snow again and that was not something she was going to do. Her silver wolf coat closed around him. Her body heat began to work against his cold. She ran. Not toward the Iron Vale settlement. She understood, in the way that reading a scene tells you what happened in it, that the pup had not fallen from somewhere. He had been placed. The specific nature of how he was covered, uniform and without the panic of accident, told her that human hands had done this deliberately. She ran to her shelter. She ran faster than she had ever run the ridge. And the pale pup, pressed against the chest of a silver wolf he could not see, breathed in the cold air of the highland and did not stop breathing. She had no idea what she was doing. This was the first thing she said to herself when she reached the shelter and got the fire going with one hand while keeping the pup against her chest with the other, and it was an honest assessment. She had no experience with pups. She had no nursing instinct to draw on, no practical knowledge of what a 3-day-old wolf needed beyond the obvious warmth and the milk she did not have. She had the fire and her body heat and the deep pragmatism of a person who has been solving problems alone for 4 years. She warmed the pup through the night by holding him against her skin, shifting the position when one part of her grew cold and he lost the advantage of it, maintaining the contact with the focused consistency of someone who has identified the task and intends to complete it. She kept the fire higher than she usually kept it, burning through more of her stored wood than she had planned to burn this week. By dawn he was warmer. Not warm in the healthy sense. Warm in the sense that the cold had lost its claim on him and he was now in the territory of survival rather than dying. He was also hungry. She understood this because he had begun to move in her hands, the blind-seeking movement of a pup looking for the source of food, his nose working with the purposeful efficiency that she had already noticed was the primary instrument of his navigation. He turned his face in the direction of the fire because it was warm and then turned away from it because it smelled wrong and then turned in a slow searching arc until he found the direction of her skin and moved toward it with the uncomplicated certainty of a creature that has identified what it needs. She felt something move in her chest watching this. She did not immediately name it. The practical problem of milk was solved by the fact that she was within a half-day of the nearest neutral settlement, where there were goats kept by a woman named Pell who had traded with Mira for 3 years in the casual way of neighboring people who find the exchange mutually useful. She went to Pell that morning, with the pup inside her coat, and she said she needed goat milk on a recurring basis and was prepared to trade her processing of Pell's winter herb harvest in exchange. Pell looked at the small pale nose visible at the edge of Myra's coat and asked no questions. Pell was a sensible woman. The first days were the discipline of keeping him alive and learning simultaneously. He took the milk from a cloth she soaked and then wrung gently over his mouth, the technique she had seen applied to orphaned animals in the settlement and which she adapted based on what he indicated was working and what was not. He indicated this through the specific responses of a creature who could not speak but had a complete vocabulary of small movements and sounds that Mira learned the way you learn a language when the language is the only form of communication available to you. A particular small whine meant too fast. A pushing movement meant he had enough. A specific quality of stillness after the feeding meant he was content. She learned all of it. She named him on the 5th day, which was 2 days after she found him, because by the 5th day she had understood enough about him to know that he needed a name and that she was the one who was going to give it. His name was Sable. Not for his coloring, which was pale and white-gray and nothing like the word. For the qualities she had already identified in him, the specific depth of his attention, the way he oriented to the world with all the senses that were available to him and used them with a focus so complete that being in the room with it felt like being in the presence of something that was paying more attention to the world than most things did. She called him Sable because he was a form of darkness that was not absence but depth. She told him his name and he turned toward the sound of her voice. He found her. She felt it again, the thing in her chest that she still had not named. The weeks that followed rearranged her life around him without her having made a deliberate decision that this should happen. She noticed it first in the way she thought about the ridge runs. She had run the ridge every third night for 4 years and the running had been entirely hers, unaccountable to any schedule but the one she set. Now she thought about the ridge runs in relation to when he had last fed and whether he would be settled for the hours she was gone and whether the fire needed to be built up before she left. She noticed it in the way she arranged the shelter. She had organized the shelter around her own requirements for 4 years. Now the arrangement shifted incrementally, the pallet moved closer to the fire, the shelving reorganized to put things she needed quickly in the most accessible positions. She noticed it most clearly on the night 3 weeks in when she woke from a dead sleep because the quality of his breathing had changed, and she was across the shelter and her hands were on him before the waking was complete. He was fine. He had shifted in his sleep and the position had changed the sound. She sat beside him in the dark with her heart doing things that her previous understanding of herself had not predicted and she thought, this is what has happened to me. She named it then. It was not quite the instinct she had heard described by wolves who had raised pups in packs, where the bonding was apparently immediate and built into the architecture of how pack animals related to their young. It was something that had grown from the specific work of keeping him alive, from the hundreds of small acts of attention that a being requires when it is new and cannot provide for itself. From the learning of his particular vocabulary and the gradual building of a knowledge of him that was as specific and detailed as any knowledge she had ever built of anything. She had come to love him through understanding him. She told him this, in the dark of the shelter, not because he could understand language but because she had begun to understand that talking to him mattered, that her voice was one of his primary anchors in the world and that the words mattered less than the presence they carried. She said, "You are mine now. And I am yours. I want you to know that." He was asleep. His small chest rose and fell with the reliable rhythm that had kept her up through the first nights and now reassured her the way a heartbeat reassures you in the dark. She pulled him closer. Outside the shelter the highland ridge was doing what it always did, existing in the cold and the dark with the complete indifference of very old things that have outlasted every expectation placed on them. Inside, the fire kept its warmth. Sable slept. The silver wolf kept watch. He grew. This was not a simple thing. It required attention and effort and the constant calibration of someone learning alongside a pup who was learning alongside her. The goat milk gave way to soft food as his teeth came in, and the soft food gave way to real food as he grew into the body that the first weeks had barely suggested. He was not a small wolf. This surprised her. She had expected, from the fragility of the first days, that he would be slight and careful in his growth. He was neither. He grew with the particular determination of something that has been told it should not exist and has decided to exist thoroughly anyway. By 6 months he was the size she would have expected from a well-provisioned pack pup. By 8 months he was larger. She had learned to narrate the world to him, describing what was where before he encountered it, so that the map he built in his mind was accurate and detailed and regularly updated when things changed. When things changed without warning he handled it. This was something she had noticed early and continued to notice. He handled disruption better than most sighted wolves she had known. Not because he was unbothered by surprise but because he had built, through necessity, an attentiveness to change that functioned faster than visual processing. By the time a sighted wolf had registered a new element in the environment and looked at it, Sable had already smelled and heard and felt the change in air pressure that the new element produced and had begun his assessment. He told her about this once, when he was a year old and they were sitting at the entrance to the shelter in the weak winter sun, the way they sometimes sat when the weather permitted and she was working on something with her hands. He said, in the thoughtful voice that meant he had been considering something for a while, "I think the way I know the world is different from the way you know it. Not missing something. Different." She looked at the side of his face, the pale profile with the ice-colored eyes that faced slightly upward, the way he turned his head when he was saying something important. She said, "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, gathering the description. "When you know something is there because you see it, it is outside you, he said at last. When I know something is there because I hear it or smell it or feel the air it moves, it is in me. The knowing lives inside. He paused. I think that means I cannot be surprised about a thing without also being changed by the knowing. There is no distance between me and what I know. She sat with this. She said, that sounds like a significant way to be. He turned his face toward her with the specific orientation he did when he was about to say something exact. It is the only way I know. He paused. Is what you do different? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she admitted. I can look at things from outside them. There is a distance. I think it is sometimes a comfort and sometimes a loss. He absorbed this. He said. That sounds lonely. She almost laughed, not unkindly. It can be, she agreed. He turned his face back to the sun. She looked at him in the winter light and thought about what he had said and about the specific way he had articulated it, and she understood that she was in the presence of a mind that the pack that had buried him had not been equipped to perceive. He first shifted at 14 months. Earlier than most, which was another thing she had not expected but which she noted without surprise because Sable had consistently done things at the pace his own nature dictated rather than the pace convention would have predicted. She was on the far side of the shelter and he was near the fire, and it happened without preamble, the shift arriving with the abruptness of something that had been building unannounced, and when she turned at the sound of it she found him on the floor of the shelter in his wolf form, white as the snow outside and large in the way that had surprised her in his growth and that now surprised her again with its full statement. He was the color of fresh snow with the faintest blue-gray shadow in it, white and deep and present, and he held very still in his wolf form in the way that she knew meant he was listening, building the sensory map of the world from this new vantage. She shifted. Her silver form moved toward him carefully, giving him the sound of her approach rather than arriving without announcement, the practice she had kept since his first weeks and which she had understood without anyone telling her was the most fundamental act of respect available to her with him. His nose found her. He made the sound that she had learned over 14 months was his version of recognition, the specific quality of a sound that meant you, the one I know, and she felt it land in her chest the way his sounds had always landed, directly and without mediation. He stood in his wolf form and he was taller than her. She looked up at him. He turned his ice-colored eyes in her direction, not quite meeting hers because the eyes oriented by direction of sound rather than by visual tracking, and the effect was of a wolf looking at something the rest of the world had not learned to perceive yet. He was beautiful. She thought this very simply and without any of the complications she might have expected. He was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are entirely themselves, without apology or concealment or the performance of what beauty is supposed to look like. He leaned down and put his massive white head against her silver shoulder. She pressed her head back. They stayed like that until the fire needed tending. She told him about the Iron Veil pack when he was 2 years old. Not everything. She told him the part that was his to know. That he had been born to a pack in the Highland Territories and that the pack had made a decision about him based on what they could see, and that the decision was wrong, and that she had found him in the snow on the high ridge and brought him home. She told him his mother had held him before they took him and that what his mother had done in those hours was the act of a woman who knew who her son was even when everyone around her had decided to see something else. She watched his face while she told him. He was very still in the way that meant he was taking something into the part of him where things lived permanently. When she finished he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You ran the ridge that night." "Yes," she confirmed. He said, "You ran it every third night." Not for any reason. She considered being more expansive about this and then decided he deserved the precise truth. "I ran it because the ridge was mine and the night was mine and I did not need another reason." A pause. He said, quietly, "But that night there was one." She held his gaze, or held the direction of his face. "Yes." He turned his ice-colored eyes toward the ceiling of the shelter, which was a habit he had when he was thinking, as though the thinking needed the upward angle to work properly. He said, "Do you think about what would have happened if you had run the next night instead of that one?" She answered honestly. "Yes." He brought his gaze back down. He said, I think the correct response to that is to run the right night every time. So that whatever needs to be found is found. He paused. I think that is what you were already doing. She felt the truth of this in the specific way she always felt the truth of things he said, directly and without distance. Yes. I think that is what I was doing, she admitted. He gave a single nod, the kind he used when something had finally settled into place. I would like to go to the ridge, he told her. To the place where you found me. Not to do anything with it. I just want to know where my life started. We will go tonight, she promised. Thank you, he replied. You do not need to thank me for that, she reminded him gently. I know, he answered. I want to. Her gaze lingered on him. He turned toward the sound of her, toward the quiet certainty of her presence. The fire held its warmth between them, just as it had since the first night she carried him home, steady, dependable, and utterly unconcerned with the larger questions the world kept asking. His third year was the year the Iron Veil found them. Not deliberately, at first. A patrol from the eastern edge of Iron Veil territory ran further than their usual boundary in the course of tracking a supply thief and came across the shelter in the rock face and the evidence of 2 wolves living in it, which was unusual enough to report and which the patrol commander reported to Alpha. Hara felt with the straightforward efficiency that her officers had learned she required. Hara felt sent a follow-up unit. The follow-up unit found Mira coming back from the settlement with supplies, Sable beside her in human form, the two of them moving through the highland terrain with the ease of people who had been moving through it together for years. The unit stopped. Mira stopped. Sable turned his face toward the unit with the exact precision of a wolf who had heard them before they had registered that he heard them, which was the first thing the unit noticed. The second thing they noticed was his eyes, pale and ice blue and oriented slightly above the point of direct contact, and the specific way he held himself, still and attentive in a manner that was not the stillness of someone unaware but of someone who was processing a great deal of information through channels the unit had not expected. The unit leader, a woman named Corse who had been on Iron Veil patrol for 6 years, recognized him. Not from memory. She had not been present the night he was buried. She recognized him the way you recognize a family resemblance, something in the bone structure and the coloring, the specific pale quality of him that matched the descriptions she had heard in the years since. She had heard those descriptions because there was a woman in the Iron Veil settlement who had not stopped. Mira looked at Corse and understood the recognition before Corse had spoken. She stepped slightly in front of Sable, not in the protective crouch of someone preparing for violence but in the deliberate placement of someone establishing that they are present and that anything directed at this person goes through them. She said, "Whatever you are here for, say it." Corse said, "We are not here to cause harm." She paused. "I know what he is." Mira said, "He is Sable Ashend. He lives with me on the eastern face. That is what he is." Corse looked at Sable with the expression of someone revising something they had believed for 3 years. She said, to him directly, "There is someone in the Iron Veil settlement who asks after you. She asks every season whether any patrol has seen or heard anything on the eastern face." Sable had been listening to the entire exchange with his ice-colored gaze directed at the middle distance between Corse and the sky. He turned his face toward her when she addressed him. "Who?" he asked. "A woman named Senna," Corse replied. The name settled into the highland air between all of them. Sable went very still. Mira did not move from where she stood. After a long silence, he spoke again. "My mother." "Yes," Corse confirmed. Quiet settled over him once more. Mira recognized the quality of that stillness now as clearly as she understood any language. This was not emptiness or withdrawal. It was presence, the careful processing of something large and exact. At last, he broke the silence. "Tell her that I am well." Corse hesitated. She would want to know more than that. Sable turned his face toward Mira. She held the direction of his gaze. "What do you think?" he asked her, not Corse. "I think," she answered carefully, "you are the only one who can decide what comes next." He turned back toward Corse. "Tell her I am well," he said quietly. "Tell her I am on the eastern face." If she wants to come, she is welcome. He paused. Tell her also that I have a family here. Not a pack. A family. Tell her I will not be leaving it. Corse looked first at Mira, then at Sable, and finally toward the eastern face of the highland ridge rising behind them. I will tell her, she promised. And she did. Senna arrived on the third day. She came alone, without Draven. Draven had left the Ironvale settlement 2 years earlier and no longer belonged to the shape of her life in any meaningful way. She arrived in the early morning while the light was still thin, the ridge washed in gray, and climbed the eastern face with the determined focus of a woman who had waited 3 years for this moment and had no intention of being stopped by steep ground. Mira met her at the edge of the shelter grounds. The two women looked at each other. Senna regarded Mira the way mothers look at the people who kept their children alive when they could not. It was not a simple expression. Gratitude lived there, and grief, and the strange complexity of someone who had imagined this moment for 3 years only to find reality both smaller and larger than imagination had prepared her for. He is inside, Mira told her. He knows you are coming. She paused. He has been very still since yesterday, which means he has been thinking about this. Is he well? Senna asked quietly. Truly. He is more than well. Mira met her gaze without wavering. He is one of the most extraordinary wolves I have ever been in the presence of. I want you to know that before you go in. Senna held Mira's gaze for a long moment. Thank you. The words were insufficient, and they both understood that, but Senna offered them anyway because they were all she had. Mira stepped aside. Senna entered. Mira remained outside. She settled onto the rock beside the shelter entrance and listened to the highland ridge. She did not try to hear what was happening inside because it was not hers to hear, and she stayed there for a long time. When Senna emerged, her eyes held the unmistakable brightness of tears that had been earned. She stopped beside Mira. He told me what you built here, Senna began softly. What you built with him. He helped build it, Mira replied. I know. Senna glanced toward the ridge. He told me that too. Her attention returned to Mira. He said you let him be exactly what he was from the first day. She paused. That is not a small thing. Mira considered this. No, she acknowledged. It is not. Senna fell quiet for a moment. He is happy here. Yes, Mira answered. Senna nodded, the kind of nod that belongs to someone trying to absorb something both beautiful and painful in exactly the proportion that certain kinds of love create. I would like to come back, she said carefully. If that is acceptable. That is entirely his decision to make, Mira reminded her. He said yes, Senna explained. He said to ask you as well. Mira looked toward the ridge. Yes. Senna left by midday, making her way down the eastern face with the same determination she had climbed it. Mira watched until the figure became too distant to distinguish. Sable had stepped out of the shelter while she watched. He stood beside her, turned toward the direction of Senna's departure, and together they remained there until even his hearing could no longer catch the sound of retreating footsteps. She held me, he murmured after a while. In the hours before. The words came without warning, as though continuing a conversation he had already been having somewhere inside himself. She held me the whole time, he continued, and she told me I was more than they could see. Mira stood quietly beside him. I did not know that then, he admitted. I know it now. Yes, Mira said softly. There is something I want to know. She waited. Did you believe it from the beginning? He asked. That I was more than they could see. Mira thought of the first night. The pup no heavier than 2 cupped hands. The impossible warmth hidden beneath the snow. The feeling in her chest when she realized he was breathing. I believed you were alive, she answered at last, and that you deserved to stay that way. She paused. Everything else I learned by paying attention. A quiet sound of understanding escaped him. That is the most honest answer. It is the only one I have. He remained beside her in the highland air. After a long moment, he gave a slight nod. I think that is enough. The year Sable turned 4, he began to run the ridge. Not every third night. Every night. He had shared this decision with Mira in the direct, uncomplicated way that belonged uniquely to him, and she had listened without offering any reason why he should not. He ran in his wolf form, white against the dark, navigating the ridge through the complete internal map he had built over 4 years of living this terrain in every season and condition. He knew where the stones shifted beneath his paws, where the wind curved differently around the eastern outcrop, where the snow gathered thickly and where it never settled at all. Each place carried its own distinct character, different from every other place. He ran the ridge because the ridge was his. That truth had formed quietly somewhere over the years of living on its eastern face. It had needed no ceremony and no declaration. It simply existed the way certain things do after enough time has passed. And in the way of a wolf growing into himself, he had started noticing things. Small things at first. A rabbit moving badly from injury. A disturbed supply cache. The remains of a fire that had no business being in the northern quarter. He brought each discovery to Mira. She listened to what he reported, observing the precision with which he noticed the world, and she found herself considering what she was seeing. This is what he is, she thought. The neutral settlement has been looking for someone to oversee the Highland Path, she told him one evening. Traveler safety on the Eastern Pass has been difficult since the storm damage last winter. Her eyes rested on him. It would pay in trade, she continued, and it would require exactly what you already do. He tilted his head slightly. Manage meaning? Knowing the terrain, Mira explained. Knowing what belongs and what does not. Making sure problems are handled and travelers in trouble are found. He grew very still, the particular stillness of someone who had just heard themselves described with startling accuracy. Like you running the ridge every third night. Yes, Mira agreed. Except with a community that knows you are doing it and can ask for what they need. Yes. A faint shift of amusement crossed her expression. Yes, to which part? All of it. He met Alpha Hara felt in the 5th year. Not because either of them had requested it. The Neutral Settlement Council arranged it. For a year they had benefited from Sable's management of the Highland Path and had developed the kind of trust that grows from consistent work done quietly and well. The council wanted a formal agreement with the Iron Veil Pack regarding the eastern border zones. Iron Veil patrols occasionally crossed into the same spaces Sable monitored, and though every encounter had remained respectful, none of it had been officially structured. The council decided structure would be wise. They asked Sable to represent them because he knew the terrain and because precision had become something people relied on in him. Hara felt arrived at the neutral meeting point accompanied by 2 advisors and the composed expression of a woman who had governed a Highland territory for 11 years and believed she had already encountered most things worth encountering. Then she saw Sable. He turned his face toward the sound of her arrival and waited with the still posture of someone entirely present. Something in the silence unsettled her expectations. There was a quality to his attention she had not anticipated, careful, exact, and deeper than what most negotiators offered during a first meeting. She sat across from him. I know who you are, she acknowledged. I know you do, he answered evenly. A pause stretched between them. Then she exhaled once. I signed the order. The table between them was made of very ordinary wood in a very ordinary meeting room, and yet the statement hanging above it was the most extraordinary thing spoken there. Yes. Hara felt drew a measured breath. There is something I would like to say about that, she began. If you are willing to hear it. Sable inclined his head slightly. Go ahead. I made the decision the law required, she explained. That part is true. She paused, carefully choosing her next words. But I did not make the right decision. That is also true. Her gaze settled on the point nearest to meeting his eyes. I have spent 4 years understanding that a law can be followed correctly and still create the wrong outcome. Her voice remained steady. I am revising the law. Slowly, she admitted. Pack law does not change quickly. But I want you to know that it is happening, and what happened to you is part of why. Sable stayed quiet longer than he usually did. At last, he spoke. You should revise it because it is wrong. Not because of me specifically. You are right, Hara acknowledged. And it is wrong because of what it creates in cases like yours. She gave a small nod. Both things can be true. He considered that for a moment. Then he shifted the conversation. What do you want from the negotiation? And so they negotiated. It lasted an hour and a half. By the end, both sides had secured what they needed, and the eastern border zone finally had a formal system that made the Highland Path sustainable. As Hara felt prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway. Without turning around, she remarked, "You are very good at this." "I know what I hear," Sable answered simply, "and what I smell, and what the air tells me." He paused. That makes negotiation straightforward. She left. One of her advisors, a younger man who had spent the entire meeting watching with the expression of someone mentally filing information for future study, lingered behind. She has been trying to revise the contribution law for 3 years, he explained. The pack elders resist it. He hesitated. She will keep trying. I know. The advisor blinked. How? She spoke like someone who has repeated the truth to herself many times, Sable observed. A certain rhythm belongs to things practiced in private. He paused. She has been telling herself the truth for a long time. She only needed someone else to hear it. The advisor had no answer for that. Eventually, he left. Sable made his way back up the eastern face of the Highland Ridge toward home. On the night marking his 5th year on the ridge, Mira ran beside him. Not in the careful, structured way of the early years when she narrated distances and measured safety between them. This time, they ran the way wolves do after years of running together. Naturally. Without effort. He went very still. How could you know that on the first night? Because you were breathing, Mira replied. You were alive in conditions meant to end you, and still you kept breathing. Her voice softened. And because the first thing you did when you were warm enough to respond was find me. She shook her head faintly. Not randomly. Precisely. You found the source of warmth and moved toward it without being able to see it. She paused. Something that knows how to move toward warmth in the dark already knows something the dark itself cannot teach. Her eyes lifted toward him. I knew that was worth knowing. He stood on the Highland Ridge beneath the winter dark, stars spread enormous above them. I found you by sound, he remarked quietly. Yes. For 5 years, he continued, I have been finding you by sound. Yes. I do not need to see you to know where you are. I know. A pause settled between them before he added, more thoughtfully this time. I think that is what family is. Mira stayed quiet. Not seeing the same things, he explained. Knowing where each other is in the dark. She looked at him. He turned toward the sound of her, toward the place he knew she stood. Yes, she answered at last. I think that is exactly what it is. The ridge held them the way it held everything, with no opinion, no preference. Old. Cold. Entirely indifferent except for the simple fact that they existed upon it, a fact it acknowledged the same way ancient things acknowledge all things. By continuing. Sable reached out a hand. Mira took it. Together they stood on the high center plateau of the northern ridge, the silver wolf and the white wolf who had once been the blind pup others tried to bury. Above them, the stars continued their quiet work of existing, scattered so thickly across the dark that emptiness felt less like absence and more like abundance. They remained there until the cold insisted on movement. Then they shifted. And they ran. Silver and white against the dark ridge. Finding one another through the sound of paws breaking snow. Through warmth moving close beside them. through the particular shape the air takes when the person you know best runs at your side. Together, they ran home. The Iron Veil Pack revised its contribution law in the 7th year. It was not called the Sable Law. Hara felt named it the Recognition Amendment because the old law had failed in one specific way. It had never learned how to recognize that contribution can exist in forms too wide for a narrow definition of capability. Senna sat in the assembly when it passed. Over the years, she had quietly joined the informal coalition Hara felt built to support the revision, not loudly, not at the center of attention, but steadily. Patiently. She had learned that change inside a pack moves only as fast as the pack itself can move, and that the real work is continuing in the right direction. When the amendment passed, she sent word to the Eastern Face. The message was brief. She had learned brevity from her son, and briefness suited what mattered. It read: "They changed the law. You are the reason. I love you." Sable read the note with careful fingertips across the raised markings Mira had developed for him over the years, a system that translated language into something his hands could understand. He sat quietly with it for a long while. Eventually, he set the page aside and turned his ice-colored gaze toward the shelter window, the one facing the ridge. His ridge. "She says they changed the law." Mira looked up from across the shelter. "I know," she replied. "The Settlement Council sent word this morning. It will help other pups." "Yes." He sat in silence for a moment. "I did not do it to change the law. I know. I did it because this was the life here." "Yes." Another pause. "That is enough." A softness entered Myra's expression. "More than enough." He nodded once, the quiet, deliberate nod he used whenever something settled into its proper place. The fire kept its warmth. The ridge kept its cold. And the silver wolf and the white wolf who had once been the blind pup lived on the eastern face of the highlands for all the years the ridge continued having years inside it. Which was a very long time. Because old things continue long past expectation. And together, they ran. Silver and white. Every night.